Judge Thapar, thank you so much for sitting down with us. I know that you have a lot to share about the law. You're a professor, but I want to talk about your personal life.
Okay.
You're a convert to Catholicism. How did you come into the church?
So it's a little bit of a longer story, but I was a Hindu growing up, and I became Christian when I was clerking and working for a couple federal judges. Marcia Carter, a judicial assistant, asked me a question, and she asked me if I thought, she was talking to me about Hinduism, and she asked me if I thought Jesus was crazy, and I said no. She said, "Do you think he lived?" And I said, "Of course." And she said, "Well, he either has to be crazy or you have to believe in him, because he said the only way to the Lord is through him." And I really started studying it then. I started listening to different preachers in the Baptist kind of area and the firebrands, really. And I actually enjoyed it, and I eventually started to make my way to become a non-denominational Christian. But once I met my wife and we got married and started having kids, we had our son, and then she was pregnant immediately with our daughter, and our oldest son, I'm sorry. And she came home, and she, when the baby came home, we all came home, I guess, and she said, "I want to explain something to you. This family's going to be Catholic, and you can be a part of it or not." And so
You can stay home on Sunday, or you can come with us.
Yes, you can stay home or you can come with us, but we're all going every Sunday. And so I enlisted in RCIA.
And what was the RCIA process like for you? Was it a very engaged process? Was it just kind of going because you wanted to be a part of your family?
No, so I had the best sponsor in the world. His name's Andy Clare, I should say that. And he would drive 50 minutes. He was a college buddy. He played football at Boston College, an amazing athlete. But more than anything, he had a heart of gold. And he really wanted me to come into the church. And, I was a lawyer, so I challenged everything. And I would get whatever the Protestants said about Catholicism, and I'd bring it. I'd find articles, I'd find papers, I'd even bring books. And we'd discuss, and we often, RCIA class was once or twice a week for an hour and a half or 2 hours. We'd be there 3.5 hours later debating things. And it was really personally rewarding and gratifying for everyone to work with me, to work through the problems I had, whether it be Mary or the Eucharist or any of those things. And I eventually started to understand. I don't know that when I committed, I was fully there, but I continue to work. It's a lifelong journey to understand and appreciate everything, whether it be about Christianity or the Catholic faith in particular.
For sure, Jesus Christ, he hides himself from us in the Eucharist, even as Catholics, right? We long and try to discover him. That's the lifelong journey. You came into the church and in a way walked away from this tradition of Hinduism that was given to you by your parents. Your parents are divorced.
Right.
How did that affect your family?
Divorce is always hard, and it really is a difficult thing for kids. Luckily, I was in college. My sister was still in high school. I think for both of us, it was a challenge. You never want your parents not to be together, not to be happy. And so that was difficult, but the one unique thing about my parents is they were very supportive of both me and my sister throughout our careers, no matter what we did. I'm the black sheep in the family. Mm-hmm. I'm the only one that's ever been a lawyer in my whole entire extended family, I think both on my side and my wife's side. And when I called my dad when I was in college and told him I was going to law school, he said, "Why would you go to grad school to work an hourly job?" So he is an Indian immigrant. He thought doctors and engineers, that's what you have to be. But
yeah, that's surprising. I would have thought that just with your background, you would have been a doctor.
Yeah. Well, my sister is. She's the crown jewel.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, how did that then affect your faith journey in knowing that your parents weren't coming with you? Was that a point of contention?
No, they were very supportive. The one thing that's unique about my parents is they really just cared that we believed in God at the end of the day, and they didn't care how we got there. And so they've been very supportive of me becoming a Catholic.
Oh, we hope that one day they'll join you in this wonderful journey of faith. let's talk about you and your wife. Obviously, she's a great model of the faith for you, the reason why you kind of yearned to have this understanding of the church to see if you could join as well. How did you meet her? Was it love at first sight?
Well, I loved her at first sight because she's beautiful and amazing, but I thought she was way out of my league, and she still is. My kids remind me that she's out of my league. But, you know, my judge, when I was clerking, thought she should go out with me, and she wanted nothing to do with it, but he was relentless. And I would say he eventually had her go out with me, and I think she eventually fell in love with me. I guess now 26 years later, I sure hope so. But yeah, she did. And we have just an amazing marriage. It's really been incredible. And the foresight my judge had to set us up was pretty neat. It took a lot of effort by him to get her to go out with me.
Wow, 26 years of marriage from a setup.
Yes.
So there is hope for us all.
Yes, that's right.
Well, you also have 3 beautiful children. What is the relationship from a faith perspective with your children as now a head of household who owns his faith?
You know, we are very proud that our kids are committed to the church and that they go to church every weekend. And one thing I found is it's a tough time to raise kids. And we could take a lot of credit, but the credit I would give is to the church. They always had a moral grounding. Taken them to church throughout their life. They went to Catholic schools, so they were in Catholic schools K through 12. Really gave them that grounding and that moral compass that I think you need in today's society where social media and all these other things impact kids in so many negative ways. If it's all about them, it becomes very hard when you're looking at images on social media or whatever comes across social media. But if it's actually about a higher thing, and in this case the Lord and the church and the faith, I think it gives kids a moral grounding that really makes them even-keeled and is really, it's a tribute to my wife, right? Because she stayed home. She really instilled the faith in them and me. And so she's done a remarkable job with our kids, and we're blessed to have them.
It allowed them to navigate the uncertainties of this changing world. Well, let's go into your book. So you're here obviously because we've wanted to have this conversation about your journey into the church, but also because you wrote a beautiful book that really shows the people in cases of law. So a lot of the time people think about the Supreme Court or your role at the Sixth Circuit as a federal judge, and they feel a little removed from it because it's not necessarily something they can easily access. A lot of the legal jargon is just hard to swallow.
Yeah.
But you're a professor, you're known for being someone who likes to be relatable about the law. And so you wrote a book with stories that tell the impact of Justice Thomas's decisions and his cases, or where he was lead in these cases, through the eyes of the person it affected. Tell me a little bit about why you wrote that.
Yeah, I think Justice Thomas is very misunderstood. I think, to be fair, the media is often critical of him, but they only give a snippet, and they only can. Like, I'm not criticizing them. I get what their job is, and they seem, to have an agenda one way or the other. But the reality is the real stories of the people that come in front of the court, the real stories of the cases are rarely told. And so what I thought is the way to explain originalism, the way to explain Justice Thomas's jurisprudence is through the eyes of the litigants, the real people whose lives are impacted by these cases. And when you read the stories of their life and how they end up in the Supreme Court, and how Justice Thomas's jurisprudence impacts them, you see something much different. You see that Justice Thomas is first and foremost an originalist, but he cares passionately about people, and I can explain why I think that's so, but it makes sense. That he has a very strong black voice, which is never reported, neither by his champions nor his critics. And that maybe most importantly, amongst all that, is for every case he rules on, he pays attention to the real people in front of the case. And his jurisprudence reflects an immense amount of caring, especially, ironically, for all the criticisms about the poor and the underprivileged, people like him that grew up in the society. If you think about where he came from, the segregated South,
right,
and dirt poor, like so poor that his mom was making $10 every week and had to give him and his brother up because she couldn't afford to raise them, to their grandfather who raised them with an iron fist and had a third-grade education but saved every penny he had to send them to Catholic schools because he understood that education meant emancipation, in the words of Frederick Douglass, which he would quote to a young Clarence Thomas, who then quotes it in his opinion.
Now that's, you mentioned two things. One, the legacy of Justice Thomas and his role at the Supreme Court, and a lot of what the media has reported are concerns around judicial ethics, concerns about the reports of gifts that have been given to him in relationships with high net worth people. What do you think is missing from that narrative?
I think what's really missing is an understanding of Justice Thomas, the person, and an understanding of Justice Thomas, the jurisprudence. And it's a real shame for the American people to get one side of it and not see the other. And that's what the book really tells, is it gives you what's really going on. It shows you in the introduction, look, the introduction and conclusion are my own. The 12 chapters in between are the stories of 12 cases that really explain his jurisprudence. But in the introduction, I point out, and I source everything. You can go read the endnotes and go get the sources. All the criticisms throughout his career that have been lobbied his way. This is nothing different. It's just that when they were doing it originally, they just didn't like that he was an originalist. They just didn't like that he didn't leave things, as he says, to the cognoscenti, the elites, but trusted the American people more. He trusts the American people more than 5 of the justices. And that's what people don't like. And it's been consistent throughout his career. It's just he used to be writing dissents, and now he's pulled not only the judiciary, but I think the American people are starting to come there. And so I think his critics are now panicking.
Well, you just used what I would call a legal dirty word, which is a word that a lot of Americans wouldn't understand: originalism. Originalism, this legal theory, this application of the law that many legal outlets, but also mainstream journalists are quoting as something that Americans should be fearful of. You're known as a professor, but also someone who tells it like it is. Explain originalism for the everyday American.
Well, I think anyone that's fearful or anyone that's a critic or a champion of Justice Thomas should read the book, because not only do you see, and I'm going to get back to the question, not only do you see originalism in practice, but you start to understand how it impacts things. So what is originalism? So the People's Justice, the book, explains it. But the way I tell you is the way I told my neighbor. So when I was nominated to the Sixth Circuit, my neighbor came running down. He's a good friend of mine, but he said, "I just read the other day you're one of those." And I said, "Mike, one of what?" And he said, "You're an originalist." So similar to what you're saying.
Dirty word.
And I said to him, "Mike, you're a businessman, right?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You sign contracts with others?" "Yes." "And you put that in writing, right?" "Yes." If you all have a disagreement between the two of you, as a judge, should I interpret what the meetings of the mind was in the contract, in the terms of the contract, or should I tell you what I think is best for the two of you and make that the ruling of what the contract is? And he said, "Of course, your obligation is to interpret the terms as we understood them when we signed it." And I said, "Mike, you're an originalist now." And he ran back up to his house. But the point being is, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's an analogy. If you think about why do we write things down? We write things down to understand them. And so you've got to understand what the American people approved. Think about me, the son of Indian immigrants. My dad came here with a one-way ticket and a $5 bill because he was one of 5 children raised by a single mom in India back in the 40s and 50s. His dad passed away when he was 2, and they literally didn't have running water, didn't have a bathroom, and his mom gave him a ticket and a $5 bill. He was the youngest. She saved up for him and gave it to him and said, "Go make something of yourself." And he flew to America. And only in this country, right, with the will and the grace of the American people, can someone like me sit on one of the highest courts in this country. And so I've got to trust the American people. That's at its core what originalism is about. Do you trust unelected judges, or do you trust the American people? People say, well, the Constitution's so hard to amend, so originalists make us stay in time. No. Where do you think the Civil Rights Act comes from? That's not the Constitution. We can pass laws. Of course, you can amend the Constitution. It's been amended multiple times since the Bill of Rights. But you can also pass laws federally, pass laws at the state level, pass things at the local level, and then the American people have more say. They're more vested in the democracy. Justice Thomas came from the segregated South and rose to the highest court in the land. I rose to one of the second highest courts. The opportunity in this country is great, but for people like us that are here by the grace of the American people, we put our faith in the American people and not unelected judges. And that's what originalism is about at its core. And I'm sorry to say one more thing.
No.
When you see it in action in the people's justice, because we can talk in nebulous and theoretical terms, it's really important to see it in action. And you can go, for example, I'm just going to pick a quick snippet. You can read about the first chapter where the only justice that accepts the NAACP's invitation to go back to the original meaning about eminent domain is Justice Thomas. Why? Because eminent domain historically was used to prey on the poor and minorities. And Justice Thomas points that out. But you won't see all the media praising him for that, right? Because in eminent domain, he wants to give the power back to the people, the individuals, the poor, and not let government prey on them.
Is that what you meant then in your challenge? You have a challenge to your readers when they open your book. Would you want to live in Justice Thomas's America? Is that what you meant by that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, you said earlier when we were talking I didn't answer it in the book, and the reason is I want the reader to answer it. Like I said, I tell you what I think both now and in the introduction and conclusion, but the real key is to read the 12 stories. And if you don't believe what they say, go read the cases. I mean, of course, the stories are going to tell you more robust because I read the entire trial record, I read a lot of the accounts, I interviewed witnesses. But when you read those cases and you see what just every ruling of Justice Thomas in the book, imagine it's the majority. Imagine in every case, you're going to, and think of that America. That's an originalist America, because as everyone says, he's the purest originalist on the court. That's an originalist America. Would you want to live in it? I challenge his critics. Even as I say at the end of the introduction, of the flap, even his critics might be surprised if they were giving it an honest read.
We talk about the Supreme Court, we're talking about Justice Thomas, and you were on the short list you're the second Indian-American federal judge, but you would be the first on the Supreme Court. Would you be nominated?
I was actually the first Indian-American.
You were the first?
Ever.
Ever,
in the country's
okay.
history. Second on the Court of Appeals. My good friend in D.C., Sri Srinivasan,
Yes.
is the first on the Court of Appeals. But I'm proud of that. I'm disappointed that I was the first. I wish it would have happened earlier, but I'm very proud of that accomplishment. And there's a reason for that, right? Most Indians are more sensible than me and Sri and the other judges. They become doctors or engineers.
Well, is it something that is a point of pride, though, for you, knowing the kind of societal rifts that we're seeing through COVID? You had a lot of unrest. Do you think that's an important thing? You talk about the legacy of Justice Thomas as representing Black people. Is that something that's also important for you?
It is in this sense. I don't think necessarily just being Indian or it's being the son of immigrants and understanding the opportunity. This is the greatest country in the world, right? And I think one of the things that's often forgot by young people is that, and I try to remind them, I go and talk in schools. I do all naturalizations, which is right, in schools. I insist on doing them in schools. Why? I want the kids to see that they were born with the gold card. You know, people die to come to this country. Why? Because it's the land of opportunity. When a kid like me can get to where I'm at, that means something not only to Indians, to all sorts of immigrants' kids, that you can accomplish anything if you put your mind to it. I think about where my dad came from, and he used to tell us when we complained, he said, this is the greatest country in the world. Roll your sleeves up and get to work, and you can accomplish anything. Justice Thomas's grandfather said to him, when he said, I can't do something, old man Kent is dead. You know how I know? I helped bury him. The same message, the message that anything's possible in this country, and I'm an example of that. Clarence Thomas is an example of that. Sri Srinivasan, Obama appointee, is an example of that. I mean, it runs throughout our nation's history, what we've accomplished, people like us, and it's the fact that we shouldn't get so down on this country because there's so much it has to offer.
You've been described by your peers and legal commentators as someone who tells it like it is, but also someone who, without using an expletive, doesn't mess around. And it's because you take the law seriously. You once jailed an 84-year-old nun for breaking into a uranium plant, is that correct?
That's
and defacing
correct.
it?
Yes.
And she was there for how long? How long was she in jail? 35 months?
Yes.
Okay. Why?
So, breaking the law has consequences, and trust me, I prayed a lot about that, but not as much as I prayed about some of the harder sentencings I've had. You know, the sentencing is really hard, but you can't make exception. Like, that's not our job. Again, if the American people say this is the right sentence, and I believe the law covers the conduct, then that's what you got to do. A jury convicted her. It was my obligation to sentence her, and it was she asked, ironically, for life.
You said she wasn't remorseful.
Well, she thought it was, to be fair, I mean, she was an objector to nuclear power, right? And so if she thought she was doing the right thing, she was an amazing woman, right? But she made a mistake. Or she committed a crime. And that crime has consequences. How can we create exceptions for one group of people because they put the religious cloth on? That can't be the exception. There can't be exceptions. Think about what went on in our church. I mean, if you start creating exceptions, where does it stop? The law has to be followed. I took an oath to uphold the law. That oath was important to me. Now, you know, maybe hopefully I get upstairs, maybe God will tell me I was wrong. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, but I think I did, to the best of my ability, what I was tasked with doing.
I think that that's one of the reasons that you enjoy support from both sides of the aisle, and that was clear in your confirmation to the federal courts. Let's talk about Second Amendment rights. This is one of the stories that you tell in this book. You talk about Second Amendment rights, and you tell a specific story about a case with the grandson of a slave who was in Chicago, wanted to have the American dream, worked his tail off to make that happen.
Yes.
And then the crime rate soared, and all of a sudden he's in a precarious situation where he wants to protect his family, and he can't. Because in Chicago, he could not own a gun. What happened in that case, and why did you tell that story?
Otis McDonald moved up from the South to pursue a better life. He was a sharecropper's son, grandson of slaves, came to Chicago and enlisted in the Army, served our country honorably, got out. The GI Bill provided him an opportunity to get an education. He pursued that education at night while he worked by day. All he wanted was to provide a better opportunity for his wife and kids than was given to him, not through anyone's fault, he recognized, but just through circumstances. He worked his tail off, as you mentioned, and bought a house in Morgan Park. It was perfect when he moved in, but at the same time, the crime was moving out in his community on the south side of Chicago. And this perfect middle-class, integrated neighborhood was suffering from gang violence and drug crimes, and people breaking in. And he, as the book recounts, 6 kind of harrowing crimes him and his family suffer, and he did different things to try and stop the crime. First, he put bars on his house. When that didn't work, he put in an alarm system. He joined a community group. He became the head of the community group. But what broke the camel's back is these kids and wife are sleeping in the house, as is he. And luckily, the neighbor saw someone that had broken in and was hiding under his car, and called the police. And Otis knew that had that eagle-eyed neighbor not seen that happen, it might be too late. By the time someone calls the police, they might be inside. And you know what was unique? What he saw in the chapter recounts it is that the criminals weren't obeying the gun laws. They had guns. The gang members had guns. He had guns pointed at him. Otis was just a hardworking janitor, head of the union because of his education, became really successful from where he came, and yet he couldn't protect his family. He had had enough. He wasn't going to wait for someone to break in and do something harmful for his family where he didn't have recourse. And so he challenged the ruling that he could not possess a gun in the city of Chicago, and that case goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. Now, we are living in a time when gun violence is rampant, and a lot of it has to do with mental illness. What can you say about Second Amendment rights and the way that Americans should be thinking about it from a theoretical perspective? Why do they matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think for people like Otis McDonald, when you read the chapter, for law-abiding Americans that have a desire to protect themselves, and because it's in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that the American people don't have a say, but they can't violate the Constitution in doing so. They can amend it, but they can't write laws that abridge the Second Amendment. And so it's no different than the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment, right? Or any amendment in the Constitution. And so it's really important that those things be balanced out. Ultimately, it's up to the American people, but our job as judges is when Otis McDonald comes and says, look, under the Constitution, I'm entitled, I'm a law-abiding citizen, a vet, understand how to hold a firearm, and Chicago won't let me possess a firearm to protect my family. I'm entitled to. The irony of that case, the punchline, right, is he wins. Justice Thomas writes a concurrence. The descendant of slaves writes a concurrence about when the 14th Amendment was passed in the Privileges or Immunities Clause. He points out back to the history that one of the reasons Frederick Douglass said, and he quotes it, he said, we will never have equality without our gun rights. Why? Because what happened in the South is they were dispossessing blacks of guns through black codes. That's why the Privileges or Immunities Clause, one of the main reasons it was passed, that chapter recounts it, and the chapter recounts it because it's just recounting what Justice Thomas said. The history, the awful history of our country that allowed this type of rampant discrimination and took the guns at the time of 180,000 freedmen in the South. To have equality, Frederick Douglass, as Justice Thomas said, believed they had to have their gun rights, just like everyone else. And so here's Otis McDonald, the grandson of slaves, remedying that right and having the descendant of slaves write the main concurrence that talks about the black codes.
It's a remarkable story and one of many in your book that describe different instances where the cases really aren't about the law. They're about people.
Right.
And everyday Americans who are affected by the law, and where you have a primetime seat now to really review some of the cases before you and make things fair for Americans. Just as a last question, what is your favorite part about being a judge? You mentioned you now, right now, have the best job, and you wouldn't necessarily want any other job. What is the best part of this job?
You know, it's my colleagues. I wish America, in a lot of ways today, resembled the courts in that we can disagree without being disagreeable. I'm very good friends with judges that see things differently than me. And we understand that. We try our best. We all try our best to get it right. My colleagues on the Sixth Circuit are amazing. I'm just so honored every day I get to work with them and sit with them and listen to them and learn from them. And it really is. I've got one of the greatest jobs, and you know, I love it. And it's been an honor and privilege to understand Justice Thomas better. Part of this was an education for me, right? As an originalist, I wanted to understand originalism as deeply as I could, and there's no one better to study than Clarence Thomas. And The People's Justice, the book, more than anything, just giving it, hoping that the American people will read it, understand the stories. And then what I always say is, give it to a critic. Let them read it. Ask them, would they want to live in Justice Thomas's America?
An invitation to dialogue from a man who argued his way into the church.
Yes, that is right.
Thank you so much, Judge Thapar.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.